Before we dive in, if you love exploring hidden corners of the world, forgotten places, and countries doing the impossible just to survive, hit subscribe to Secret Earth and give this video a like. It genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one. Now, let's get into one of the strangest survival stories on the entire planet. Picture a nation of nearly 18 million people, home to some of the world's busiest airports, most productive farmland and most livable cities. And now picture that entire country sitting in large part below the surface of the sea. Not near the sea. Not close to sea level. Actually below it, in some places by more than 6 meters, protected only by walls of earth, concrete, and centuries of stubborn human engineering. That country is the Netherlands, and the truth about how it exists is far stranger than most people realize. This isn't a nation that got lucky with geography. It's a nation that, quite literally, built itself out of the sea, foot by foot, dike by dike, pump by pump, for more than 1,000 years. And today, as sea levels rise and the ground beneath Dutch cities keeps sinking, that ancient battle between people and ocean is entering its most dangerous chapter yet. In this video we're going to explore how the Dutch actually lived below sea level, how they built an entire civilization out of reclaimed land, what happens when the water wins, because it has, more than once, and what the future really looks like for a country whose very existence depends on staying one step ahead of the sea. Get ready, because nothing about this story is as simple as it looks on a map. Just how much of the Netherlands is actually below sea level? Let's start with the number that shocks most people the first time they hear it. About a quarter of the Netherlands sits below sea level. Some sources put the figure closer to 26%, and if you include land that's no more than 1 meter above sea level, that share climbs to roughly half the entire country. This isn't a small strip of coastline either. It's the most densely populated, economically vital part of the nation, home to well over half of the entire Dutch population. The lowest point in the country, a polder called Zuidplaspolder near Rotterdam, sits about 7 meters below sea level. Schiphol Airport, one of the busiest hubs in Europe, sits roughly 3 to 4 meters below sea level, meaning that every single day millions of travelers take off and land in a spot that, without human intervention, would simply be part of the seafloor. Much of Amsterdam itself sits 1 to 2 meters below sea level, kept dry only through a constant, tireless system of pumps, canals, and dikes working around the clock, every single day of the year. Without this system, without the dunes, dikes, dams and pumping stations that the Dutch have spent centuries building and refining, close to 2/3 of the country would flood during high tide. Let that sink in for a moment. Nearly 2 out of every 3 square kilometers of the Netherlands would simply be underwater right now, if not for constant, deliberate human effort. How does a country like this even exist? To understand how the Netherlands pulled off something that sounds almost physically impossible, you have to go back centuries to a time when much of the western part of the country was little more than swamp, marshland and shallow coastal water, regularly swallowed by storm surges from the North Sea and flooding from 3 major rivers, the Rhine, the Meuse and the Scheldt, all converging into one low-lying delta. Long before modern engineering, early inhabitants of this region built small artificial mounds of earth, known as terpen or weerden, just a meter or 2 high, enough to keep a village and its livestock above the waterline during floods. It was a modest but crucial first step, proof that people were determined to live in a place nature never really intended for permanent settlement. Over time, that determination evolved into something far more ambitious. Starting around the Middle Ages, the Dutch began systematically draining sections of marshland and shallow lake, enclosing them with earthen walls, and pumping the water out to create dry, farmable land. These reclaimed areas became known as polders, and building them would go on to become one of the defining engineering traditions of the entire nation. A polder is essentially an artificial piece of land, enclosed by dikes, where the water level is actively controlled and kept lower than the surrounding water table. Left alone, a polder would simply flood again within days. Kept dry through constant pumping and drainage, it becomes some of the most fertile, valuable farmland and real estate in all of Europe. Today, the Netherlands has roughly 3,000 polders, and remarkably, close to half of all polder land in northwestern Europe is located within this single country. Since the 1300s, the Dutch have reclaimed more than 7,800 square kilometers of land from the sea and from inland lakes, an area larger than the entire country of Puerto Rico, created essentially from scratch, through centuries of patient, unglamorous engineering work. The process of turning open water into usable farmland was never fast. After a polder was drained, the soil beneath it remained wet, salty, and mushy for years, unsuitable for serious agriculture. Dutch farmers historically planted salt-tolerant vegetation first, allowing plant roots to bind the loose soil together while rainfall gradually washed the salt out of the ground. Only after roughly 15 years of this slow transformation would the land finally become productive enough for real farming, a process that speaks volumes about the patience baked into Dutch culture itself. For centuries, windmills were the beating heart of this entire system, tirelessly pumping water out of the polders and into higher canals, which eventually carried it out to sea. While most of those functions have since been taken over by electric and diesel-powered pumping stations, some traditional windmills are still kept operational today, both as working pieces of infrastructure and as living monuments to how this entire nation was quite literally built by hand. The most ambitious province in the country, Flevoland. If you want to see land reclamation on the grandest possible scale, look no further than Flevoland, the newest province in the Netherlands, only officially created in 1986. Almost the entire province sits on land that didn't exist as dry ground before the 20th century. It was reclaimed from a former inland sea called the Zuiderzee, largely during major engineering projects carried out in the 1950s and 1960s. Flevoland today is home to hundreds of thousands of people, along with farms, forests, entire towns and modern infrastructure, all built on ground that, within living memory, was simply open water. It stands as one of the clearest, most dramatic examples anywhere in the world of a country deliberately expanding its own landmass, not through war or diplomacy, but through drainage pumps and sheer engineering willpower. This kind of land creation completely reshaped how the Dutch think about their own territory. Rather than treating coastline as a fixed boundary, dictated entirely by nature, generations of Dutch engineers have approached it as something negotiable, a frontier that, with enough determination and technical skill, could be pushed steadily outward, decade after decade. The Delta Works, one of the modern wonders of the world. Everything changed on the night of January 31, 1953. A violent storm swept across the North Sea, driving powerful winds and towering waves against a coastline protected at the time by roughly 1,100 kilometers of dunes, dikes and pumping systems. None of it was enough. In the middle of the night, as tides surged higher than anyone had prepared for, dikes failed in dozens of places at once. Within hours, the southwestern Netherlands had effectively been cut in two. Around 100,000 people were evacuated from flooded, low-lying areas, but the disaster still claimed roughly 1,800 lives, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern Dutch history. That single catastrophic night became the turning point that shaped everything the Netherlands has built since. In direct response, the Dutch government launched what would become known as the Delta Works, an enormous, decades-long system of dams, sluices, storm surge barriers, and reinforced dikes built to seal off the country's most vulnerable river estuaries from the open sea entirely. The project is so vast in scope and engineering ambition that the American Society of Civil Engineers has named it one of the 7 wonders of the modern world, placing it alongside achievements like the Panama Canal and the Golden Gate Bridge. Among the most impressive pieces of this system is the Oosterscheldekering, a massive storm surge barrier stretching several kilometers across open water, fitted with 62 enormous steel gates that normally remain open, allowing tidal flow and marine life to pass freely, but that can be closed within roughly an hour whenever a dangerous storm surge threatens the coast. It represents a philosophy that runs through practically all modern Dutch water engineering. Work with nature whenever possible, but be ready to fight it decisively the moment it turns dangerous. Life inside the dikes. What daily existence actually looks like. For most Dutch people living below sea level, this extraordinary reality has become so deeply woven into daily life that it barely registers as remarkable at all. Ask someone from Amsterdam, Rotterdam, or The Hague whether they worry about rising seas, and you'll often get a shrug followed by some version of, "We'll just build the dikes higher." That casual confidence isn't recklessness. It reflects generations of lived experience with a system that, for the most part, simply works. Dikes crisscross the entire western half of the country, some so massive and central to daily geography that nearby residents grow up with an almost instinctive, unconscious relationship to them, as familiar and unremarkable as a hillside or a river might be anywhere else in the world. Water management touches nearly every part of Dutch civic life. Ancient regional authorities called waterschappen or water boards have existed since medieval times, specifically tasked with managing dikes, canals, and drainage in their local area. Remarkably, these water boards still exist today, function as their own layer of government, and hold their own elections, meaning that, in the Netherlands, controlling water is treated as important enough to deserve its own dedicated democratic institution, separate from national or municipal politics entirely. Even Dutch farming reflects this reality. Roughly 3% of the population works in agriculture, yet thanks to intensively managed polder land and extraordinarily efficient techniques, The country ranks among the top 3 agricultural exporters on Earth, trailing only the United States and France, an almost unbelievable statistic for a nation smaller than many American states, a huge portion of which technically sits below the ocean's surface. The hidden threat beneath the ground: subsidence. Rising seas get most of the global attention, but ask Dutch water engineers what actually keeps them up at night, and many will point to a quieter, less visible danger: the ground itself is sinking. This process, known as subsidence, happens as drained peat soil, common across much of the low-lying western Netherlands, gradually oxidizes and compacts once it's no longer saturated with water, causing the land surface to slowly drop, sometimes by centimeters per decade. This creates a genuinely unsettling feedback loop. As the peat soil dries out and sinks lower, it becomes even more vulnerable to flooding, requiring even more aggressive water management to keep it usable, which, in turn, can accelerate the very drying process causing the sinking in the first place. Some low-lying polders that once sat close to sea level now sit several meters below it, entirely because of this slow, gravity-driven settling of the ground beneath them, independent of anything happening out at sea. Combine that steady sinking with rising sea levels driven by global warming, and you get a genuinely dangerous double pressure. The sea is climbing while parts of the land are simultaneously dropping to meet it. Dutch engineers openly acknowledge this is one of the most serious long-term challenges the country faces, one that no dike, however tall, can fully solve on its own, because the ground people are standing on keeps quietly moving beneath their feet. Climate change and the new water reality. For a country whose entire existence already depends on outsmarting the sea, climate change isn't some distant, abstract threat. It's a direct escalation of a battle the Netherlands has been fighting for centuries. Rising global temperatures bring rising seas, but they also bring more intense, unpredictable rainfall, sometimes described by Dutch water managers as increasingly monsoon-like weather patterns that older infrastructure, designed for a gentler climate, was never built to handle. Heavier rainfall means more water needs to be pumped out of polders more quickly, putting additional strain on drainage systems that already work at their limits during ordinary storms. At the same time, rising sea levels mean the starting point for any storm surge along the coast keeps creeping upward year after year, making the margin for error in the delta works and coastal dikes progressively thinner. Dutch officials and engineers are refreshingly candid about the scale of this challenge. As one water management expert put it, nature always finds a way to fight back somehow, an acknowledgement that no engineering system, however brilliant, offers a permanent, guaranteed victory. Instead, staying safe increasingly means constant reinforcement, continuous monitoring, and a willingness to keep raising dikes, upgrading pumps, and rethinking flood defenses indefinitely, essentially forever, for as long as people choose to keep living in this extraordinary engineered landscape. The room for the river approach: fighting water by giving it space. Interestingly, not every modern Dutch solution involves building bigger walls. Over the past 2 decades, the country has increasingly embraced an approach known as room for the river, which works by deliberately widening floodplains, relocating some dikes further inland, and lowering certain riverbanks, giving rising water more space to safely spread out during periods of heavy rainfall or river surge, instead of concentrating dangerous pressure against a single defensive line. This philosophy represents something of a shift in Dutch thinking. Rather than treating every drop of water as an enemy to be walled out entirely, engineers increasingly design landscapes that can flex and absorb pressure, reducing risk through smarter design rather than sheer defensive height alone. Some of these reclaimed floodplain areas double as parks, nature reserves, or agricultural land during dry periods, only filling with water during genuine emergencies, a clever blend of everyday usefulness and long-term flood protection working together on the very same land. This more flexible approach also reflects lessons learned from watching other flood-prone regions around the world struggle when they rely purely on ever-taller barriers. Given enough time, water tends to find a way past static defenses. Giving it controlled, intentional space to go, rather than fighting it head-on everywhere at once, has become an increasingly central part of how the Netherlands plans for its long-term future. What happens if the water ever truly won? It's worth pausing to consider just how catastrophic failure would actually look in a country this dependent on engineered protection. Some estimates suggest that if the country's dam and dike systems were to suddenly and completely fail, several million Dutch citizens could find themselves in immediate, life-threatening danger, given how much of the population lives clustered in low-lying areas below sea level. This is precisely why Dutch flood defenses aren't built to modest, everyday safety standards, but to extraordinarily high statistical thresholds, engineered to withstand storm events expected to occur, in some cases, only once every 10,000 years. a level of caution far beyond what almost any other country in the world applies to its own flood infrastructure. That extreme standard isn't paranoia. It's a direct, hard-earned lesson from 1953, when the country learned in the most brutal way imaginable, exactly what happens when the sea is underestimated even briefly. Even so, engineers and disaster planners across the Netherlands remain remarkably candid that no system offers absolute, permanent guarantees. Emergency evacuation planning, flood simulation exercises, and public awareness campaigns continue alongside the physical infrastructure itself, reflecting a sober, clear-eyed understanding that living below sea level will always carry inherent risk, no matter how sophisticated the engineering protecting it becomes. A nation whose identity was shaped by water. Beyond the engineering and the statistics, there's something deeper worth understanding about the Netherlands. This relationship with water isn't just a technical challenge the country happens to manage, it's fundamentally part of the national identity itself. There's a well-known saying among the Dutch, God created the world, but the Dutch created the Netherlands. It's said partly in jest, but it captures something genuinely true about how this country understands its own existence. Centuries of collective effort to reclaim land, build dikes, and manage flooding required an extraordinary degree of long-term cooperation between communities, regions, and generations who often had little else in common politically or culturally. Some historians argue that this shared, ongoing struggle against the sea helped shape distinctly Dutch cultural traits: pragmatism, consensus-driven decision-making, and a deep, practical respect for collective infrastructure that benefits everyone, rather than just the individual property owner immediately behind any single dike. That legacy still shows up in small, everyday details across the country. Windmills, though largely retired from active pumping duty, remain treasured cultural landmarks. Canals aren't just scenic backdrops for tourist photographs in cities like Amsterdam, they're functioning parts of an active water management system that has kept the city habitable for centuries. Even Dutch cycling culture, so famous around exporting expertise, how Dutch water knowledge shapes the world. Because the Netherlands has spent so many centuries refining the art and science of living below sea level, Dutch water engineering expertise has become one of the country's most valuable exports, quietly shaping flood defense projects across the entire globe. Dutch engineering firms have consulted on major infrastructure projects in cities like New Orleans in the United States, following catastrophic flooding from Hurricane Katrina, as well as in low-lying coastal regions across Asia and other parts of Europe facing similar rising sea challenges. This growing export of knowledge reflects a genuine and increasingly urgent global reality. As climate change accelerates sea level rise worldwide, more and more coastal cities and nations are essentially facing a smaller-scale version of the exact challenge the Netherlands has spent 1,000 years learning to manage. Rather than treating their own precarious geography purely as a vulnerability, the Dutch have, in many ways, transformed centuries of hard-won survival knowledge into genuine global leadership on one of the defining challenges of the 21st century. Dutch universities and research institutions, particularly those focused on hydraulic engineering and water management, are now considered among the very best in the world, attracting students and government officials from vulnerable coastal nations who travel specifically to the Netherlands to learn firsthand how a country can genuinely thrive while sitting, in large part, below the surface of the sea. Frequently asked questions about life below sea level in the Netherlands. To wrap up with a bit more clarity, let's quickly run through some of the most common questions people ask about this remarkable country. Is the entire Netherlands below sea level? No. Only around a quarter of the country sits below sea level, concentrated mainly in the western and northern polder regions. The eastern and southern parts of the country, including areas near the German border, sit at higher, more typical elevations, with the country's highest point reaching over 300 meters above sea level. Could the Netherlands really flood completely? In theory, without its extensive system of dikes, dams, and pumps, a majority of the country's western half would flood regularly. In practice, Dutch flood defenses are engineered to extraordinarily strict safety standards, making a catastrophic, nationwide flood extremely unlikely, though not entirely impossible, especially as climate pressures continue to intensify in the coming decades. Do Dutch people worry about climate change and rising seas? Generally, yes, though often with a distinctly practical, unpanicked attitude shaped by centuries of experience managing water-related risk. Rather than viewing rising seas as an unsolvable existential threat, most Dutch people and their government tend to treat it as simply the next engineering challenge in a very long, ongoing tradition. Why doesn't the Netherlands just move its population to higher ground? Relocating tens of millions of people, along with some of the country's most valuable infrastructure, agricultural land, and economic activity, would be extraordinarily disruptive and costly. Given how effectively the current system of water management has worked for decades, continued investment in reinforcing and upgrading existing defenses remains, by far, the more practical path forward. A brief history, from marshland to maritime power. To really appreciate what the Netherlands has achieved, it helps to rewind even further, to a time long before any dike or windmill existed in this part of Europe. Around 2,000 years ago, much of what is now the Western Netherlands was an untamed patchwork of tidal marsh, peat bog and shallow lake, regularly reshaped by storms and river flooding, home to scattered communities who built their lives on slightly higher patches of ground wherever they could find them. By the early Middle Ages, local communities began organizing more systematically, digging small drainage ditches to make marshy farmland slightly more usable, and gradually linking these efforts into larger, coordinated systems. As settlements grew and the stakes of flooding became higher, entire villages began cooperating on shared dikes, recognizing early on a truth that still defines Dutch water management today. A dike is only as strong as its weakest section, so protecting your own land means working closely with your neighbors, whether you like them or not. By the late medieval period, land reclamation had become a defining feature of Dutch economic and political life. Wealthy merchants and local governments invested heavily in draining lakes and marshes to create valuable new farmland, fueling the rapid economic growth that would eventually help launch the Dutch Golden Age of the 17th century, when the Netherlands became one of the wealthiest, most powerful maritime trading nations on the planet, an empire built, in no small part, on land its own people had engineered into existence. This deep historical relationship between land reclamation and national prosperity helps explain why, even today, Dutch culture treats water management not as a peripheral technical issue, but as something close to a founding national project, as central to the country's identity as any king, war, or revolution might be to other nations. Amsterdam, a capital city built on wooden poles. Few cities on earth illustrate the strange relationship between the Netherlands and water quite like Amsterdam. Much of the city sits on soft, waterlogged soil entirely unsuitable for supporting heavy buildings in its natural state. To solve this problem, generations of Dutch builders drove long wooden poles, sometimes tens of meters deep, through the soft peat and clay until they reached firmer sand layers below, essentially building the city's foundations on an enormous underwater forest of timber pilings. Amsterdam's famous canal ring, now recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, wasn't built purely for scenic beauty. It functions as an active water management system, regulating water levels throughout the city and providing crucial drainage capacity during periods of heavy rain. The canals also historically served as the primary transportation network for the city's booming trade economy, allowing goods to move efficiently between the harbor and warehouses scattered across the urban center. Today, keeping Amsterdam dry requires a constant, largely invisible effort. Pumping stations continuously move water out of the city's canal system and into surrounding waterways, while building foundations require ongoing monitoring and maintenance, since even those ancient wooden poles can begin to rot or shift if groundwater levels change unexpectedly. It's a quiet reminder that even one of Europe's most beloved, most photographed cities exists only because of relentless, ongoing engineering effort beneath the surface that most visitors never even think to consider. Rotterdam and the Maaslankering, guarding Europe's busiest port. If Amsterdam represents centuries-old Dutch ingenuity, Rotterdam represents its ultramodern evolution. Home to one of the largest and busiest ports in the entire world, Rotterdam sits at the mouth of the Rhine-Meuse Delta, making it one of the most economically critical, yet also most flood-vulnerable cities in the entire country. Protecting this vital economic hub falls largely to the Maaslankering, one of the largest moving structures ever built by human beings. This colossal storm surge barrier consists of two enormous curved gates, each roughly as long as the Eiffel Tower is tall, capable of swinging shut across the waterway within hours whenever forecasters predict a storm surge dangerous enough to threaten the city. When open, ships pass through freely, keeping one of the world's busiest shipping routes fully operational. When closed, it transforms into an impenetrable wall standing between the North Sea and millions of people living and working just upstream. The Maaslankering operates almost entirely automatically, using advanced computer systems to continuously monitor water levels and weather conditions, deciding independently when closure is necessary without requiring a human operator to make that life-or-death call under pressure. It stands as a powerful symbol of how far Dutch water engineering has evolved, from simple earthen mounds built by medieval farmers to fully automated, computer-controlled barriers protecting one of the most important ports on the planet. Schools, cycling, and childhood in a country shaped by water. Growing up in the Netherlands means absorbing an unusually practical relationship with water from a remarkably young age. Swimming lessons are considered an essential part of Dutch childhood, not simply a recreational activity, but something close to a basic life skill, given how much of the country's landscape is crisscrossed with canals, rivers, and drainage ditches. Many Dutch children obtain official swimming diplomas well before finishing primary school, a quiet acknowledgement that, in this particular country, knowing how to survive in water isn't optional. Dutch schools also frequently incorporate water management and flood history directly into their curriculum, teaching children from an early age about dikes, polders, and the devastating 1953 flood, ensuring that each new generation understands exactly why the infrastructure surrounding them exists and why maintaining it matters so much. Field trips to pumping stations, historic windmills, and flood defense museums are common, turning water management education into something tangible and memorable, rather than an abstract lesson confined to a textbook. Even the country's world-famous cycling culture connects back to this engineered landscape. The flat terrain created by centuries of drainage and land reclamation makes cycling remarkably practical across most of the country, while extensive, well-maintained dike paths often double as some of the most scenic cycling routes in the nation, offering elevated views across the surrounding polder landscape that would otherwise be entirely invisible from ground level. Farming below sea level, turning vulnerability into abundance. It might seem almost paradoxical that some of the most productive agricultural land in all of Europe sits below sea level, protected only by dikes and pumps, yet that's precisely the reality across much of the Dutch polder landscape. The nutrient-rich soil left behind by centuries of river sediment and careful land reclamation has proven extraordinarily fertile, once properly drained and managed. Dutch farmers have become world leaders in maximizing agricultural output from remarkably limited land, pioneering advanced greenhouse technology, precision irrigation systems, and highly efficient livestock farming techniques. This intensive approach helps explain how a country roughly the size of the American state of Maryland manages to rank among the top agricultural exporters on the entire planet, trailing only much larger nations like the United States and France. This agricultural success, however, comes with real trade-offs tied directly to the sinking soil problem discussed earlier. Drained peat soils, so valuable for farming in the short term, continue gradually oxidizing and compacting over time, slowly lowering the land even further below sea level and requiring ever more aggressive water management just to keep fields usable. Some Dutch agricultural regions are now actively experimenting with slightly wetter farming techniques, deliberately raising groundwater levels in certain areas to slow this subsidence process, even if it means accepting somewhat different, less intensive farming methods than in the past. Living with water instead of just fighting it. In recent years, Dutch water management philosophy has increasingly shifted toward a more nuanced relationship with water, moving beyond simply building ever higher walls to keep it out entirely. Floating homes, once a rare curiosity found mainly on historic houseboats, have become an increasingly serious architectural solution in certain Dutch neighborhoods, designed specifically to rise safely with floodwater rather than being damaged by it. Amphibious housing developments, particularly in flood-prone areas near rivers, now incorporate homes built on hollow, buoyant foundations that allow entire structures to float upward during flooding, then settle gently back down once water levels recede, all while remaining connected to flexible utility lines designed to handle this vertical movement without disruption. These experimental neighborhoods represent a genuinely different mindset. Rather than treating any flooding at all as an unacceptable failure of infrastructure, they treat occasional flooding as a manageable, even expected, part of life in a low-lying delta nation. Urban planners in Dutch cities have also begun incorporating so-called water squares, public plazas specifically designed to double as temporary flood basins during intense rainfall, collecting and holding excess stormwater until drainage systems can safely process it, then draining completely and returning to normal public use once the danger passes. It's an elegant, quietly ingenious solution that turns flood management infrastructure into genuinely useful public space, rather than isolating it as purely functional, hidden machinery beneath the city. The Wadden Sea and the dunes that started it all. Long before dikes and pumping stations existed, the very first line of defense between the Dutch coastline and the North Sea was something far more natural, a chain of sand dunes stretching along the western edge of the country, built up over thousands of years by wind, tide, and drifting sand. These dunes remain critically important today, forming a living, self-repairing barrier that absorbs much of the ocean's raw energy before it ever reaches inland communities. To the north, the Wadden Sea forms another crucial natural buffer, a vast tidal flat region stretching along the coastline of the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, alternately submerged and exposed with the rhythm of the tides. This unique ecosystem, recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, plays a surprisingly important role in coastal protection, absorbing wave energy and sediment in ways that complement, rather than compete with, the engineered defenses further inland. Dutch coastal management today increasingly focuses on reinforcing these natural systems rather than simply replacing them with concrete. A striking example is the so-called sand motor, an enormous artificial peninsula of sand pumped onto the coast near The Hague, designed specifically to be gradually redistributed along the shoreline by natural wind and wave action over the course of many years, continuously replenishing dunes and beaches without requiring constant, repeated human intervention. It's a clever hybrid approach, using targeted engineering to essentially recruit nature itself as an ongoing partner in coastal defense, rather than treating every grain of sand as something requiring direct human placement. The economics of staying dry, what it actually costs. Maintaining a country where a quarter of the land sits below sea level doesn't come cheap. The Dutch government invests enormous, ongoing sums into flood defense infrastructure, waterboard operations, dike reinforcement, and pumping station maintenance every single year, treating this spending less as a discretionary budget line and more as an absolute, non-negotiable cost of national survival. Beyond direct government spending, the broader economic value protected by this system is almost impossible to overstate. The areas below sea level contain not just millions of homes, but also critical infrastructure including Schiphol Airport, the Port of Rotterdam, vast stretches of some of the most productive farmland in Europe, and the beating economic heart of cities like Amsterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht. Economists studying flood risk consistently conclude that the cost of maintaining and upgrading Dutch flood defenses, however substantial, remains dramatically smaller than the catastrophic economic losses that would result from allowing these areas to flood. This calculation also explains why the Netherlands continues investing heavily in climate adaptation even as costs rise. Rather than viewing rising sea levels purely as an emergency expense, Dutch planners increasingly treat continuous reinforcement as a routine, permanent line item, built into long-term national infrastructure planning decades into the future, much the way other countries might permanently budget for road maintenance or public education. Comparing the Netherlands to other nations fighting the sea. The Netherlands isn't the only country grappling with the challenge of low-lying, flood-vulnerable land, though it remains one of the most extreme and most successful examples anywhere in the world. Cities like New Orleans in the United States, Venice in Italy, and Jakarta in Indonesia all face varying degrees of similar pressure from rising water and sinking ground, though each with dramatically different resources, historical infrastructure, and levels of success in managing the threat. Venice, for instance, has built its own version of a storm surge barrier system, known as MOS, directly inspired in part by Dutch engineering principles, designed to protect the historic city from increasingly frequent and severe flooding. Jakarta, meanwhile, faces such severe subsidence and flooding risk that the Indonesian government has taken the extraordinary step of planning to relocate its entire capital city to a new location on a different island altogether, a far more drastic response than anything the Netherlands has ever seriously considered for its own low-lying regions. What consistently sets the Dutch approach apart is the sheer depth of institutional experience and cultural commitment behind it. While other nations are often forced to rapidly develop flood expertise in response to a specific crisis or disaster, the Netherlands has been continuously refining this exact body of knowledge for the better part of 1,000 years, creating an unusually deep, remarkably stable foundation of engineering expertise, governance structures, and cultural buy-in that few other nations can currently match. Tourism in a country built on water. Interestingly, the very same engineering that keeps the Netherlands dry has also become one of its biggest tourist draws. Visitors flock from around the world to see the iconic windmills of Kinderdijk, a UNESCO World Heritage Site featuring 19 beautifully preserved historic windmills, once used to drain a low-lying polder and now standing as living monuments to centuries of Dutch water management ingenuity. Amsterdam's canal ring draws millions of visitors annually, many of them completely unaware that the picturesque waterways they're photographing are actively functioning flood control infrastructure, not merely scenic decoration. Boat tours through the canals often include commentary on the engineering history behind the city, turning what might otherwise be a purely aesthetic experience into a genuine lesson on hydraulic engineering and urban survival. Even the massive delta works have become something of a tourist attraction in their own right, with visitor centers built directly into some of the storm surge barriers, allowing curious travelers to walk across structures engineered to hold back the full force of the North Sea, learning firsthand about the disaster that inspired their construction and the technology that now keeps millions of people safe. For a country whose survival depends on infrastructure most nations would keep entirely hidden from public view, the Netherlands has found a way to turn its relationship with water into a genuine source of national pride and international fascination. What ordinary Dutch life looks like today. Strip away the statistics and the engineering marvels, and daily life for most people in the Netherlands looks remarkably ordinary, in the best possible sense. People commute to work by bicycle along flat, well-maintained paths, many of them running directly atop centuries-old dikes without a second thought. Children play in parks built on reclaimed polderland, unaware that the ground beneath their feet was, within relatively recent memory, open water or swamp. Farmers tend fields that sit meters below the surface of a sea, visible, in some places, just beyond the horizon of a nearby dike. Commuters pass through Schiphol Airport, one of the busiest transportation hubs in Europe, built entirely on land that would otherwise be part of the ocean floor. Families gather in canal-side cafes in cities like Utrecht or Leiden, enjoying scenic waterways that double, quietly and invisibly, as active components of the very system keeping their homes dry. This seamless blending of extraordinary engineering achievement with completely unremarkable, everyday normalcy might be the single most striking thing about life in the Netherlands. For millions of Dutch citizens, living below sea level isn't a daily source of anxiety or wonder. It's simply home, shaped by infrastructure so thoroughly integrated into the landscape that most people rarely stop to consider just how extraordinary their everyday surroundings actually are. Before wrapping things up, here are a handful of quick facts that help capture just how strange and remarkable this relationship between the Dutch and the sea really is. Despite constantly fighting to keep water out, the Netherlands has, over the past few hundred years, actually grown larger in total land area, thanks to centuries of deliberate land reclamation projects steadily pushing its coastline outward into the sea. The country's water boards, responsible for managing dikes and drainage at the regional level, are older than the modern Dutch national government itself, with some tracing their origins back to medieval cooperative agreements between neighboring villages centuries before the Netherlands existed as a unified nation. Schiphol Airport, sitting several meters below sea level, occupies land that was once part of a large inland lake called the Haarlemmermeer, fully drained during the 19th century using what were, at the time, some of the most powerful steam-driven pumps ever built. The Delta Works project took over 3 decades to complete, spanning from the years immediately following the 1953 flood disaster all the way into the 1990s, representing one of the longest continuously running engineering projects in modern European history. Some low-lying Dutch polders sit low enough below sea level that, without active pumping, they would sit permanently underwater even during the calmest weather imaginable, with absolutely no storm or high tide required at all.